Hi guys, I'm Paul Pluter and welcome to the ArchieLuxury corporate channel. Today guys, I want to talk about the wristwatch that nearly killed Tudor. That's right, the wristwatch that nearly killed Tudor. Let's run the intro and let's discuss this nasty animal. Okay guys, Paul Pluter on the ArchieLuxury corporate channel. The animal I am talking about is the Tudor Hydronaut 2. This is the watch that nearly killed Tudor. And I gotta tell you, this wasn't a bad watch. It wasn't a bad watch at all. Let me explain where this watch sits in Tudor's history. So basically guys, the 1950s up until the 1990s, Tudor had the Tudor Submariner, basically a poor man's Submariner. In the late 90s, Tudor decided a very different tact for Tudor itself. This was their campaign. Be anything but obvious. It should have been be anything but saleable. And I've got to tell you, this watch itself, the Tudor Hydronaut 2 and Hydronaut 1, were responsible for nearly killing Tudor. Let me explain. Tudor itself was the poor man's brand of Rolex. If you couldn't afford a Rolex, you bought a Tudor. Tudor traditionally they used Rolex cases with generic ETA based movements. What happened was Tudor themselves in the late 90s, they wanted to do something more special. They didn't want to just be the poor man's Rolex. No, they wanted to be anything but ordinary. Now, why would you say when Tudor in this period had a book full of different models, why would the Hydronaut be so detrimental when there were so many other watches which surely they must take some of the blame as well? Well, no. See, the top selling Rolexes in the late 90s were the sports genre. The Submariner, the GMT, the Daytona. So, out of those genres there, it was really the Submariner which was the popular model. So, Tudor, the model they had as their steel Submariner alternative was very important. So, basically, what happened with Tudor is, in 1999, Tudor went funky. Their advertising campaign, be anything but obvious, romantic, hipster type. And they engineered a watch which was very different than the traditional Rolex Submariner. This was a watch which had a recessed bezel. It was very different. It could pass as a dress watch. It could be a sports watch. It didn't have an oyster link bracelet. No, it had sort of a combo President or Jubilee style bracelet. And it wasn't just a cheap person's Rolex. No, definitely not. This was a well-engineered, well-crafted wristwatch. Now, let's have a look here and see what happened. So from the 1950s until the 90s, the late 90s, Tudor had the Tudor Submariner, which was basically the cheaper alternative to a Rolex Submariner. In 1999, Tudor released the Hydronaut 1. Now, it was modestly successful, but they decided to give it a facelift in 2009, and they went for the Tudor Hydronaut 2. This was the second incarnation. It was more trendier, more different, more it was an interesting genre. Now, this watch, interestingly enough, has more of a cushion type of case. If you compare the edges of this to a Rolex Submariner, this is actually quite curvy. It also features a recessed case where the bezel just resides in a sunken part of the case. So a lot of engineering went into this piece here. It was also a slightly larger size. It's 40.5 mils, so it was bigger than a Rolex Submariner. But it was actually quite thin at 10.7 millimeters thick. The bracelet itself was a no compromise, but it was a bit confused. Was it a Jubilee? Was it a Oyster? Was it a President style bracelet? It was kind of a mix of those three styles. It wasn't done cheaply. This was a screw-in bracelet. Normally on cheaper bracelets that Tudor has done, they had the older Rolex technology, but this bracelet itself wasn't anything that Rolex had used themselves. So it was kind of a unique Tudor bracelet. Now, I gotta be honest with you, this watch itself came out 2009. It is on par with mid-2000s Rolex Submariner. Yes, it's very different. Tudor's trying to establish this brand as a different, more hipper sort of alternative, not just a poor man's Submariner. The bezel, it's countersunk to the case, that's a cool bit of engineering. It's not a cheap way to do things. It featured a reliable workhorse. It featured the ETA 2824-2 movement, which is a movement well regarded. But what went wrong? And this is the problem, is that this model itself, this was the whole point of Tudor, is that Tudor, these were people who wanted to buy a cheaper Rolex Submariner, and when they came across this, it was completely the wrong genre. Completely wrong genre. The market for this was people who didn't have quite enough money for a Rolex Submariner, or the Submariner wasn't in stock, so they went for a Tudor. But this, is it a dress watch? Is it a sports watch? What is it? And I mean, you can look at it and say aesthetically it's quite a pleasing watch, but this watch here nearly killed Tudor. This watch nearly killed it. And it's not because of trying. This was not just a cheap, nasty alternative to the Submariner. No, this was a well thought out, well executed, heaps of money in R&D and development and design was put into it. However, the market didn't bite. That's right, the market did not bite on this piece at all. Not interested. And it tanked. The the Hydronaut 1 never really achieved the sales that Tudor wanted, but Tudor put that down to change in marketing, and the market's got to get used to it. Everything about it is quality. The bezel's got a very nice, very precise feel, unidirectional bezel. It's got a nice pearl dot. There's nothing you can really hate about this Tudor. However, it ain't no Submariner. This is the problem. It was no Submariner. So this watch here was an awfully fine watch indeed. However, the buyer, who was somebody who didn't quite have enough for a Rolex sub, this was exactly what they didn't want. This is the sort of thing maybe their fathers would buy, but definitely not what they wanted. And that is the unfortunate thing with the Hydronaut 2. It was a stinker. A stinker. Came out 2009. In 2013, Tudor changed tact. Tudor changed tact. What did they do? Well, let me tell you what they did. They released the Tudor Black Bay. That's correct. This is what saved Tudor. This is what saved Tudor. This was a very retro. It harks back to the traditional Tudors of old. No crown guards, but a more modern size. Also, Rolex was introducing ceramic bezels on their Submariner line on the Black Bay. We got because it's a retro piece, we've got the aluminum bezel. Very, very good keeping. So the snowflake hands, so many, the gilt dials, so many key elements are there. But the sad thing is, the Hydronaut wasn't a bad watch at all. It wasn't a horrid watch. It was quite engineered. It was unique. It was a quality piece, but the market didn't want it. And that's the problem. This watch here, Tudor put the Hydronaut as its bulk, bread and butter. This was the piece that would make or break Tudor. And it failed dismally. If this piece had been launched, say, with the Black Bay, it may have survived as a dressy alternative, like a Tudor version of a Turnograph. But they didn't. And the rest, as they say, is history. Is it a terrible, horrible watch? No. It's quite well engineered. It's quality. It's a cool design. But it's the Black Bay which saved the company. Tudor looked back to the history books, updated the size, made it thicker, bigger, and meaner. Initially, they used an ETA movement as well. Later on, they brought out a 70-hour power reserve in-house movement. They also made it even more retro with faux rivet bracelet. This is what the market wanted. And it's quite a sad thing. This watch here, if only it hadn't been a Submariner replacement, it may have succeeded. This would have been a perfect date-just alternative. But it was marketed in the wrong category. And that's probably the biggest mistake of the Tudor Hydronaut 2. The Black Bay came in. It swooped up sales. And where were they pinching sales? Well, this Hydronaut was supposed to take people who couldn't afford a Rolex sub. It was supposed to be a stopgap to stop people going to other brands. Where did they go? Omega, Tag Heuer. That's where they went. They went to other key brands. Tag Heuer itself, from 2000 to 2009, had phenomenal sales. One could argue Tudor the Hydronaut gave them sails on a plate. In that same time period, Omega had such success with the Seamaster. They revised the Seamaster line. They had the Planet Ocean pumping strong. They had a lot of success. All people who didn't want the Hydronaut. The Hydronaut became an obscurity. And that's the sad thing. If only the Hydronaut had been launched as a Tudor answer to the Turnograph, it would have been such a cool watch. The Black Bay did come in and save the show, but it was the nail in the coffin to the Hydronaut. Currently, Tudor has quite a few ugly watches, but they were never make or break pieces like the Hydronaut 2. The Hydronaut 2 was put into a position of power and it failed to perform. The Black Bay namesake then spawned the Black Bay chronograph. It then spawned the slightly smaller version, Black Bay 58. Not to mention Baselworld 2018, where the Black Bay brought out the GMT Pepsi in Tudor. The Hydronaut could have, but it was never in the same running. It was never there. Very, very sad tale of woe. But thankfully, the Tudor Black Bay's come back fighting. It has upstaged Omega at Baselworld 2018, and it's also taken sales away from the upper end Tag Heuers. So it has done what was necessary. It's restored the status quo for Tudor. Tudor has become everything they wanted the Hydronaut to be. It goes back to that old advertising, be anything but obvious. Unfortunately, the Hydronaut was not to be. I'm Paul Pluta. This is the ArchieLuxury corporate channel. Please like, subscribe, and tell your corporate friends. And don't forget to take a look at my other channel, the Paul Pluta channel. I thank you for your time and keep watching ArchieLuxury Corporate.